There's actually two ways that you can trim aircraft in WarThunder. The first one is a force trim method. Most aircraft use this in real life. The second is adjusting each trim axis manually to get a much more fine adjustment. There's also a way to save your trim settings. That way you can set a default trim for each individual aircraft. Or whenever you join a new match or you respawn, it'll spawn you in already adjusted to a specific trim setting. And you can do this for each individual aircraft in WarThunder. First, before you can edit your trim controls, you need to make sure that you are in full real controls. As you can see at the very bottom and on the left side, the trimming section completely disappears unless you are in full real controls. The first key binding is trim helicopter. This is the typical way to trim an aircraft or a helicopter. And the way it works is you hold the stick and pedals where you want it. So I'm adjusting my pedals and my stick manually. And whenever I finally get to the trim position that I want, and once my helicopter kind of steadies out, I can press the trim button and it holds the trim. You can see on the bottom it tells you what trims that were adjusted. Now obviously it wasn't a perfect trim. To get an ideal trim, there's a couple things you want to do, which I'm not really good at trimming. I don't really use it that much, but if you want to get a good trim, make sure you set your collective or your throttle, if you're in a plane, to a certain number. Make sure that you get to a certain speed. Like you want your speed to reach a steady state. That way, once you're done making your adjustments, it's not going to change the drag on the plane or its effect on control surfaces based on the speed of the aircraft. So it's not going to start off smooth and then bank off a certain direction. So you want to reach a certain speed and ideally climb rate, but if you can't get all of that at once, it's fine. And this will allow you to make much more accurate shots. Oops, I reset my trim buttons. So now I set my trim controls, and I can make slight adjustments a little bit easier. Not perfect. Personally, I don't prefer trimming. Kind of messes me up. Now, not all aircraft have trim controls. Some have partial trim, where they can trim their elevator or they can trim their aileron, but most top-tier aircraft, they have trimming, and they have trimming for all control surfaces. And you might be wondering, well, why would I need to trim a jet? Well, let's say someone shoots your left wing, and you have a lot of drag on your left wing. Well, you might, you can use the damping mode if it has a damping mode, but if it doesn't, you're going to have to rely on trimming. And being able to trim your aircraft, even though jets don't have much torque, having their aircraft move a certain way like propeller planes do, it's still a very valuable tool to use in certain situations. And for helicopters, trimming's it's a completely different beast. It's very difficult, except for the cam ops. The trimming for those is really easy. You don't even really need to trim. But all the helicopters, because they're affected by their speed, by their collective, and based off of how you're moving the cyclic, there's so many different ways that a helicopter would need to be trimmed. It's not as easy as it is on a plane. And there are some methods that you can do to help trim your helicopters and your aircraft. I'll show you on an aircraft first. So let's see, we'll just pick a random US plane. Corsair. So right now we have a Corsair. Most aircraft have this system in them. Not all, but you'll notice down here we have this little gauge here, and for different nations they typically will have slight variations of this. Like the British, they don't have this little ball thing. They actually have something a little different, but for the most part, most aircraft have this thing on them. Some of the top tier may not have it, but a lot of the World War II planes have this kind of gauge. You'll just have to find what it looks like for each nation. But the ball here and this little, gauge that rocks back and forth are the banking and the rolling, respectively. So this is telling you how much you're banking. So you can see when I'm holding my left rudder pedal forward, you can see that it's telling me that I'm banking a lot to the left. So when the ball's on the right side, like it is there, that means you are banking to the left, and that you should make adjustments to your right with the pedals. So as you see, I'm going to my feet, back to a more neutral position. The ball's almost where I want it, and I can save the trim setting for it. But now you can see this little kind of, what do you call it? Metronome, this little stick, this little hand, it's pointing to the L. That means I am rolling to my left, and it wants me to, if I want to level the plane out, I should be rolling to my right. So I'm going to adjust the trim manually with the axis. I'll show you how to do that later. Or you can do it, this way, where you set everything where you want. Get the rudder and the stick exactly where you need to get the plane going as straight as possible. And you hold it. Not perfect. There's a reason why I don't use this method of trimming that much, but it works, for emergency situations. If you need to make a really big adjustment really quickly, like if someone blows your wing off, you can use this method to quickly get your trim where you need to, and then you can use the second method, which I'll show you, to make those fine-tuned adjustments to get your plane going as straight as you need to. This is very helpful in sim-EC when you're flying for 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how far you're flying and how slow your plane is. Really useful if you're in a bomber and you're trying to climb at a certain angle and a certain speed so that you can get to a certain altitude before you start your bombing. There's so many different ways you can use trimming for planes. Helicopters, again, it's a different beast, but you can definitely trim for helicopters. I'm just not very good at it because I don't use it. So hopefully you understand how this little system works. So next, we have Trimmer's Fixation. This is how you're going to save your trim controls, so that whenever you join a new game or you respawn, it will spawn you with your default trim controls. I'll show you how to do this in a moment. Let me go over these trim axes. So you have elevator, aileron, and rudder trim axes. The way these work is it's an axis key binding, and you set either a axis to it, or you can set a increase or decrease value to it. I highly recommend you set this to relative control and keep value for disabled axis. Turn those both on. For enable axis, this is where you would want your trim modifier button. For me, I have select, so that I hold down select, and then for elevator, I move my hat switch up and down. For aileron, I move my hat switch left and right. And for rudder trim, because I didn't have a third axis, I twist the joystick. Since I'm not using this for anything else, I figured I might as well just use it for rudder trim. But again, I have to hold down my trim button, which for me is select/button 11. You need to have relative control on, and you need to have keep value for disabled axis on. For sensitivity, though, I recommend lowering the sensitivity to like 10 or 20%, and don't have relative control step. You're going to need to make very fine-tuned adjustments, and relative control step is just not fine enough. Because even though like it adjusts by a percentage, like 1 to 2, 3%, it actually records the values in, smaller numbers, like I guess non-integers, like 1.2% or something like that. So you want your relative control sensitivity as low as possible. I highly recommend, if you're going to do this, set it to an axis. Like if you're doing it the way I do, set it to an axis like this hat switch, and make sure for your view controls it's also an axis. This is something I didn't mention in the view controls video, but you'll notice when I am trimming, oops, my camera doesn't move. It just stays perfectly still. But if I were to put controls here. Oh, crap, hold on. Gotta unplug my Xbox controller because for whatever reason it's doing that crap. Okay. So if I were to have the axis here, it's the same exact buttons, just not as an axis. It's just an increase and decrease value button. Now, whenever I try to trim and it moves my camera. So wait, what the hell? Why is it not doing it? Oh, wait, is it because of this? Okay, there you go. Yeah, now it's moving my camera. Now, if you're using an Xbox controller, I do not recommend setting your trim controls to the joysticks if you're using the joysticks for things like your rudder pedals, pitching, rolling, and throttle. I recommend setting the adjustments to the D-pad, but then you also have the rudder controls. Not sure how you do that. I guess you could set the rudder trim to one of the joysticks. Which one? I don't know. You could set it to the throttle, like where the throttle is, because you're not going to be adjusting your throttle anyways if you're trimming. So you could set the rudder axis trimming to up and down if this is where you have your throttle, and then elevator and aileron to the D-pad. Now, I'm not sure if this actually counts as a joystick. Let's find out. Because if it does, if the D-pad counts as an axis, that'll help you out immensely without having to worry about looking around while you're moving your trim controls. Unfortunately, it does not work. It works for the triggers, but does not work for the D-pad, unfortunately. But there actually might be a way around this. Let me try something. So we're going to try U and battle X axis and left and right, and then we will also do the same for the trim controls, or aileron trim. And I know I have to hold down this button to do it. But as you can see, I'm not looking around when I'm holding down the modifier button, and it still works. So just make sure if you're going to have trimming and looking around on the same buttons, that you have both of them either set to an axis, to the same axis, or both set to the same buttons. That way, stuff doesn't get overridden by each other. So with that very important but kind of weird detail out of the way, now I can explain trimmer's fixation and how to adjust the aircraft with the trim axes. Some planes, like the SBD or SBC-2, this thing is a nightmare to take off in if you've never, flown in sim before. Most people, they won't know to, like, push their rudder pedals forward, and they'll be pulling back on the stick really hard. You'll see how much this thing rolls. Like, it's really hard to take off of this thing if you don't know what you're doing. So for beginners, what you can do is you can set a pre-flight trim so that once you take off, it'll hold it. So for example, this SBC or whatever, you want to actually set your elevator trim to like -15 and your rudder trim to about 30. Elevator trim to about -15. Or -10, -15 is okay. Aileron trim, I think we can leave that alone. But I'm just going to move it a little bit to the right. And I'm going to press my trim saving button, which is button 4, the big black button. You'll see that it says everything is saved. So we're going to take off real quick just to make sure the trim settings work. See, I'm barely touching, well, barely. Now I'm barely touching it, and it's basically going to kind of take off on its own. Since the elevator's going down, it's obviously pointing down a little bit, but that was a lot smoother. I didn't really have to touch the stick that much. I did have to touch the pedal a little bit. That might have been too much rudder. But that's a good way that you can have the trim controls. And you'll notice, like when I die here, or if I reset the trim controls, so trimming set to 0. When I respawn, it'll automatically set your trim to whatever you saved it to. And you can save the trim in test flight, you can save it in a battle, and it'll carry over to anything, any multiplayer battle, any custom battle, but it's only for that specific aircraft. So if you want a certain trim setting for another aircraft, you're going to have to go into a test flight with that other aircraft and do this. Quick overview of how I have my sim controls. The select button is the button that turns on, enables all the sim control buttons. And as for axes. As for how I adjust it, I use this hat switch for the elevator up and down, aileron left and right, and for rudders, I twist the joystick. For saving the controls, you don't have to do this, but I have select and the trigger. Sometimes on some helicopters it shoots the gun, but on an aircraft it doesn't. So you can change it if you want. Just find out where you want the buttons. For resetting, I have select big red button. For trimmers fixation, I have select button 4. Although honestly, I may not even need that because I could probably get away with just removing that key binding entirely, or putting something else there that's a little more important. And I also have select and the side button as changing my control scheme. It's not really a trim control, but it's the closest thing I could think of. And that's pretty much it for trim controls. And I'm not going to go over how to trim each individual aircraft. I mean, hopefully I explained how to trim everything, like helicopters and props. There's not really anything else that you'd need to learn how to trim. And in the next video, I will go over radar. But I don't know all the different kinds of radar there are. I don't have all the top tier jets, and I don't have all the top tier radar guided missiles. But I will tell you roughly how to use all the radar controls and what each one does. Stay tuned for that.